Tollymore, A Place to Ponder and Pray by Peter Hoover. Chapter 2, Young George. For the rest of his life, George Blackwell's youngest brother Edwin remembered that day, precisely, in spite of his mere 9 years of age when it happened. Already a hot morning in January. Australian magpies' loud but magnificent warbling songs from the gums, interspersed every so often with the even louder plaintive squawks of the ravens. Quack, quack, quack. They made Edwin smile. Sounds like they're suffering tummy ache, he told his sister Annie, barely 2 years older. But she did not listen. Who's coming? She stared at a lone horseman coming fast, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. Edwin and Annie did not need to explain their alarm. A bushranger? Why so fast? But when the horse plunged into the river, emerged, and came straight to the Newry mill where the Blackwells lived and worked, they correctly identified the rider's mission. A bearer of news. A messenger. Mum had seen him too and came. So did their eldest sister, Caroline. But Dad and Tommy, their 12-year-old brother, both working in the mill, had not noticed the arrival. What? Edwin heard his mother's alarm. Not our George? Yes, the rider said reluctantly in a small voice. It was your son George. Mum wailed. The horse, quivering nostrils, bathed in sweat, stood trembling. And the young rider, looking like he had ridden all night, dismounted stiffly. In a low voice, reluctant to say what he needed to say, continued. It happened yesterday, on the River Inglis. Your son George tried to ford the river, the estuary, that is, at high tide, at king tide. We told him, the rider lifted his eyes, but he did not listen. He plunged right in. The horse lost his footing, and thrashing about to get back to shore, he lost him. He lost? Yes, he lost George, and the tide quickly carried him out seaward. Oh, no, no! By this time, Dad had come, and Tommy. He tried to swim back, the rider continued. He could swim well, your son, George. We could see him for a long time, but he never got closer. Mum covered her ears and ran to the house. Caroline followed. Dazed but British, Dad asked woodenly, Did you find him again? I don't know, the rider answered, but almost certainly the sea would have washed him back at the next tide, don't you think? Annie and Edwin did not know which way to turn. To Mum in her grief, or to Dad, who could no longer talk. So instead, they went bush together for a while. For weeks, a blur of activity followed. Yes, young George's body came back, and they buried him at Tollymore on Table Cape. Already taller than Dad and strong. Oh, how Edwin had admired his eldest brother, George. Blonde and cheerful, bold, diving into work with a will, trotting up the stairs in the mill with 100-pound sack of grain on both shoulders. Who ever had a better and nobler brother like young George Blackwell? Edwin remembered him only too well, and Dad, when they left to sea to Australia, almost exactly 5 years earlier. The Blackwells and Mum's family, the Margats, had lived for centuries, who knows how many centuries, at Arnsbury in Leicestershire, in England. There, Dad always worked in the mill. Hard work, day after day, with no good opportunities to get ahead until glowing reports came from the furthest reaches of the empire. Australia! How good it sounded! So much land for free, such a demand for qualified mechanics, builders, wheelwrights, carpenters and stonemasons, and yes, also qualified flour millers. An Australian, Alexander Clark of Longford on the island of Van Diemen's Land, had just asked for a miller to come and manage his mill. There we have it, Dad had declared in triumph. I could work in Australia, own land, and what do you know, we might well be able to build a decent house for ourselves. This with a pleasant and healthy climate, especially in the part they call Van Diemen's Land. Oh, George, Mum had objected. Isn't that exactly the place where they put the worst criminals from all over the empire? Oh, they do, Dad had said. But do not worry, all the worst criminals live in large prison compounds. One of them, called Port Arthur, named after the current governor of the island. Everything is well controlled. Only the harmless ones can get out and work on sheep stations as sealers and miners. Mum looked doubtful, but step by step it all came together. Dad and young George, Dad's name was also George, embarked on the clipper Lightning, from Liverpool Harbour on the 6th of January 1855. Travelling with him came Uncle John Margetts, Mum's brother, a young married man also leaving his wife and small child, a little boy called Stephen, behind. All in good spirits, but wondering soberly what the future might bring. It took 5 months until the first letter from Australia came back to England. Mum slit the envelope, her hands trembling slightly, while all crowded round to hear. Young George had outdone himself in writing. Mum read his letter first. George Francis Blackwell, Newry, Van Diemen's Land, the 12th of April 1855. Dear Mum, greetings. You cannot believe this. We made a record, the fastest trip ever from Liverpool to Melbourne. Only 73 days. It was very cold at first. Ice caked the hull, but we could still move as straight as an arrow through the high seas, leaving a long wake behind us. Oh, Mum, you should have seen the Lightning, the finest clipper afloat, with gilded carved work along her stern, her bottom shining bronze and the rest of her hull painted black. Inside she was pearl-coloured, relieved with white, and her waterways painted lead. We steerage passengers could not enter the grand staterooms, but I saw them. The dining saloon was wainscoted and painted pure white, like enamel, and was relieved with gilded mountings and flower work. We sat along mahogany tables with settees along its sides and mirrors along both walls, forwards and aft, that made it look even longer. We crossed the equator on my 13th birthday and saw the lights of Cape Town, South Africa, but did not stop. It turned steadily warmer, and when we finally docked at the port of Melbourne, it was hot. From Melbourne, Dad, Uncle John and I found passage on a much smaller ship, the Black Swan, to Launceston. Only 20 other men beside us and 2 women. And now, at Newry, Dad and I have found our place in the mill, a good race and dam along the Esk. Uncle John, in nearby Longford, has started to butcher again. Write to me, and greetings to all the rest, from your faithful son, George. Oh, how I miss that boy, Caroline wailed. But without any more words, Mum disappeared into her bedroom. She's reading her letter from Dad, Tommy explained wisely. Let's just leave her alone for a while. The separation in the Blackwell family did seem long and drastic. The ends of the earth, Grandma Margetts would declare. But like our Lord Jesus said, Christians will go there, as far as people can go. But did it really have to be our family doing it? Mum and the rest, torn in two by dreading to leave all things familiar behind in England, did look forward to seeing Dad, Uncle John and George again in Australia. Letters kept coming and going. 2 years passed until the great and final day came, the 22nd of May 1857. Edwin, now 6 years old, wearing a sailor suit, stood on the wharf at Liverpool with Mum, Tommy, Caroline and Annie, with plucky old Grandma Margetts, 69 years old, along with Aunt Anne, Uncle John Margetts' wife, her little son Stephen, and a raft of other close relatives and friends, all Tasmania bound, 13 men, women and children all told. Unlike the proud clip of the Lightning that carried George and his dad to Australia 2 years earlier, this group of relatives came on a slower and smaller Canadian ship, the Sir William Fenwick Williams. 145 immigrants on board, £15 per family, undertaking the long voyage as steerage passengers. Annie and Edwin, who had not understood the term steerage passengers before, learnt it now, in a hurry. After the fancily dressed and obviously important passengers had boarded, a stocky boatswain, tow-headed with a hearty voice, cheerfully called the remaining passengers to attention. All steerage passengers will now proceed to the hatches, fore and aft. Your space is limited. Please consider others. You may pick up your rations twice a day at 1 p.m. and later at 6 p.m. All passengers shall be in bed by 10 p.m. You will find toilets on board for women and children. Men and boys 6 years old or older need to use the heads on the lee side of the ship. Tom, who had turned 9, glanced at Edwin and grinned. Mum frowned at him and kept on listening. No naked lights allowed at any time, the boatswain continued. No smoking allowed between decks. 3 safety lamps will be lit at dusk and all lamps will be blown out at 10 p.m, saving one on the main hatchway. Everyone is to rise early unless otherwise instructed by our surgeon. Tommy and Edward both liked the boatswain. Once dressed, he continued, roll up your bedding, and all males 14 years or older will take turns sweeping the decks. Chuck all trash overboard. With their trunks, bags and little ones secured around them, all immigrants then found their way up the gangplank and into surprisingly cramped accommodations on board. Tommy and Edwin needed to share one berth, 6 feet long and 3 foot wide. It's too tight, Edwin grumbled. I don't want Tommy's hair in my face. He's bringing far too much stuff, besides himself. Don't worry about it, Mum tried to make peace, whispering so not all the rest would hear. If you don't like it, what about having Tommy's head on one end and yours on the other? That won't work, Edwin objected stoutly. Then he will kick me in the gut. Tommy, more gallantly, tried to accommodate his luggage as nicely as possible, while helping Mum and the girls, as far as he could, to the women's quarters. Only one board separated the boys' berth from that of their Uncle William Marget's, left in charge by Mum, who must have seen further disputes likely. They'll sleep fine, he assured Mum, his sister, on their donkey's breakfast mattress, and at least the bolsters don't stink. Almost imperceptibly, the Sir William Williams, after tossing off its ropes and with its sail set, began to move. It seemed strange, and by tea time, Mum and Grandma Margetts declared they could not eat a bite. Not the first night, but during subsequent days and weeks, courageous immigrants entertained the steerage passengers with songs, recitals, and even some dancing and games. Sadly, during the first month at sea, most, if not all, passengers felt sick. Some of them, like Grandma Margetts, moved from simple nausea into life-threatening serious illness. Is she even breathing at all? Mum anxiously asked the surgeon when he came to check her out. She has not responded for well over 24 hours. We'll see, he told her, while drawing a mirror from his bag. I'll hold this over her nose and mouth. If she's breathing at all, some condensation will cloud the glass. For a moment the Blackwells and Margetts held their breath, but sure enough the evidence appeared. Not only that, the following day, the very day they neared Cape Town, Grandma Margetts opened both her eyes and asked for a drink. Wiping tears, Mum hastened to bring her tea and a sip of gooseberry wine. May and June had passed. All of July, now in the heart of the southern winter, dragged by. One long day after another, racked by sickness and fearful storms. Hatches stayed closed, portholes shut, and only flickering lanterns portrayed miserable, sick and unhappy passengers caught in the stench of the sick and the wails of unhappy children. The ones, to be sure, that had survived so long. Grandma Marget's sickness returned several times. Tommy and Edwin had long stopped fighting for space. Too sick, too unhappy to demand things at all, they hardly remembered how to cheer when the dawn of the 21st of August 1857 revealed land. Van Diemen's Land, halfway around the world. Grey and cold, this Tuesday morning at Hobart Town left its inexorable impression on all British immigrants arriving on the Sir William Williams. They no longer call the island Van Diemen's Land, a passenger informed Mum. They now call it Tasmania. Whatever the name, blessed relief from the stormy sea welcomed the incoming passengers as they came sliding serenely into the expansive port of Hobart Town. The mouth of the River Derwent, Tommy informed the rest. I've been studying the map on the wall of the ship's saloon. An awesome harbour, surrounded with wooded mountains, bays, islands, and by now with the first signs of buildings, a church spire, the quay. One of the finest harbours on earth, Uncle William Margetts said. But what are they doing there? Annie asked sharply, pointing to the left, on what they came to learn was Sandy Bay. Grandma Margetts squinted, shielding her eyes with her hand. Then, "Oh, children, don't look that way, don't ever." Mum caught the sight and gasped, covering her eyes with a moan. "No, not this." But the closer the ship passed Sandy Bay, both Tommy and Edwin could not help but peek. 3 men, now silent and still, hung from ropes on a timber frame, high above a cemetery. Rows upon rows of graves, many of them looking quite fresh. Mum had a tough time adjusting in Tasmania, even after they sailed in a schooner to Launceston, on the northern shore of the island, and where they met Dad and George at Newry on the Esk. For a long time, after the overwhelming meeting with George and Dad, she could hug and cry, but she could not speak. Too tired, too much to process at once. But the rest of the children, and George, who had grown so much, and whose voice had changed, could not get enough words in sideways. So much happened. Dad, a bit thinner, could not stop smiling. "Do not worry, dear," he kept repeating to Mum. "Just a bit of an adjustment. But the Lord willing, it will all work out. We are all here. We are young and strong, and give us a few years, we'll be back and running." Grandma Margaret, thinner than ever and pale, but with her lace cap and widow's weed still intact, rallied once she could walk on land again. "What, may I ask, have you eaten during these 2 years?" she wondered, inspecting the cupboards, and soon found the pantry in the miller's house. "Who did the cooking? George, I see, has grown, but you turn thin. You watch. We'll fix you up." Everything seemed better. Everything came right again, although the Blackwells joked about walking about upside down, feet up on the bottom side of the earth. Even the cuttings of the gooseberry bush, the potato pieces, the ones that had the eyes on, and the little apple trees they had brought from England survived, in spite of the fact that fall was now spring and spring was fall. Even Mum, after 3 years, began to laugh about the kookaburras and began to enjoy cooking. "I declare," she said, after taking a long sniff from the bubbling pot, "if you didn't know it, you'd insist this wallaby stew would come straight from the butcher's in good old Arnsby at home." "At home?" Dad smiled. "Oh, have it your way," she laughed. "We can call it home here in Newry if you wish, but you still know what I mean." Mum laughed again. Grandma Margaret pulled her lace, working out again, adjusting her spectacles to sit on the rocker on the veranda, while Annie and Edwin explored the Esk and brought a baby orange-bellied parrot home. "An orphan," they explained. "We couldn't just leave him alone to die." Life took on a new order and peace reigned until George, now 18, left with Uncle John Margaret's to explore newly opened sections along the coast. A day's travel west along the coast, west of the River Inglis, where George, always hopeful, always cheerful and courageous, planned to stake a claim. But George, blonde, hearty and hale, miscalculated, and drowned in the Inglis when the tide was high. Never, never, never could Edwin forget that morning when the messenger came.